Boston was waking up slowly. Autumn leaves swirled in the morning wind, colorful like scattered pieces of stained glass. Lights flickered on in the windows of brick houses, and the streets filled with cars and the smell of fresh coffee. Sarah sat by the window of her third-floor apartment, staring at the gray sky. In her hands was a mug of tea, long gone cold. She hadn't even noticed when she stopped drinking. It simply rested in her palms, as if she were trying to warm herself with something familiar. She was 30. She taught English literature at a local college, and her students admired her for her gentleness and patience. But inside Sarah, there had long been silence. In the next room, her husband, Daniel, was getting ready. A lawyer at a prestigious firm, a man who always knew what he wanted. His suits hung neatly in rows in the closet, and his life was scheduled by the hour. "You have another early hearing?" Sarah asked when he walked into the kitchen, adjusting his tie. "Yes," he replied curtly, glancing at his phone. "Meeting with a client after lunch, and I may be late tonight. Don't wait for dinner." She nodded. In that "don't wait" lay everything. Their marriage had long since turned into routine, exchanges of perfunctory phrases, the occasional weekend together, and even then his mind was occupied with work. Sometimes she tried to bring the warmth back. She cooked his favorite meals, suggested going out, even tried to start a conversation about children. But each time she received the same polite, weary later. "You look tired," he suddenly said, looking at her a moment longer than usual. "Yes, probably," she smiled. "Lots of classes at the college." He nodded and returned to his phone. And in that moment she felt a wave of emptiness rising inside her. She wanted to cry out, "Look at me! Notice me! I'm still here." But she stayed silent. When the door closed behind him, the apartment was once again filled with silence. Sarah set her mug in the sink and turned on the radio just to drown out the sound of emptiness. Life at the college was different. Students laughed, argued, brought her essays on Shakespeare and Woolf. Here she felt needed, at least a little. But even in the noisy corridors, sometimes the weight of longing pressed down on her. In the evenings, when she came home, the apartment greeted her with darkness. Sometimes she felt as though the walls were reproaching her. "You chose this. You agreed to this life." She would slip off her coat, heat up something simple for dinner, and sit alone at the table. The television murmured in the background, but she hardly listened. That night, lying in bed alone, she once again stared at the bedroom door. She never closed it fully, always left a crack, as if afraid of being locked in. And for the first time, Sarah thought that this door left ajar was a symbol of her marriage. Everything seemed near, yet between her and Daniel there was always a gap, where the cold darkness seeped through. And deep inside she knew, if that gap ever opened wider, her life would change forever. The college lived its own life. The hallways were filled with the scent of paper, coffee, and autumn coats that students hung on hooks by the entrance. Sarah was walking down the corridor with a stack of notebooks when she heard behind her, "Excuse me, could you tell me where room 304 is?" She turned around. In front of her stood a man of about 35, tall, wearing a gray jacket without a tie. His hair was slightly tousled, and in his hands was a folder of documents. "Third classroom on the 4th floor," she replied with a smile. "You're in luck. I'm headed there myself." "Perfect," he said with a sigh of relief. "My name's Mark Wallace. I'm the new history professor. Sarah Miller. Literature." She introduced herself, brushing her hair back slightly. They walked together. The conversation flowed easily. Mark spoke about moving from New York, about how he had long wanted to teach in Boston. His voice was warm, with a faint touch of irony. Sarah realized she hadn't felt such genuine interest in someone's words for a long time. "And how do you like it here?" he asked as they reached the floor. "Calm," she answered. "Sometimes too calm." He smiled, and in his gaze there was a spark, as if he caught the hidden meaning of her words. A few days later, they ran into each other again in the faculty lounge. Mark was sitting at a table with a mug of coffee, leafing through papers. When he saw her, he looked up. "Oh, Miss Miller, care to rescue me from boredom. Bored already? She teased. I'm used to New York's pace. Here everything feels slowed down. Sometimes slowness is a cure, she said, taking a seat across from him. Once again, their conversation flowed easily. They talked about books, student essays, the differences between generations. Sarah found herself laughing, truly laughing, bright and sincere. She realized she hadn't laughed like that in a very long time. That evening, returning home, she recalled their exchange. The apartment was quiet again. On the table lay a note from Daniel. Late meeting. Don't wait. She set her bag down on the floor, glanced at the empty kitchen, and suddenly felt her thoughts drifting back to Mark. His voice, his gaze, his faint smile, they had left a strange warmth within her. Lying in bed, Sarah once again stared at that ever-ajar bedroom door. And it seemed to her that now, beyond that narrow gap, there wasn't only emptiness. It was as if someone were waiting for her there. The week flew by unnoticed. Sarah increasingly found herself looking forward to her encounters with Mark. Sometimes it was a brief exchange in the hallway, sometimes a shared discussion about student projects. He was someone with whom silence was as easy as conversation. One evening, after the students had already gone, Sarah lingered in the classroom, grading notebooks. There was a knock at the door. "May I?" Mark peeked in, holding a book in his hands. "Of course," she replied, hiding a tired smile. "I thought you might find this interesting," he said, placing the book on her desk. "It's a rare edition of Moby Dick. I found it in a second-hand bookstore nearby." Sarah ran her hand over the cover. For some reason, her heart quickened. "You figured out so quickly that I love the classics?" "Not quickly," he smiled. "I was just listening carefully." Those words lodged deep inside her. Attention! That was what she so badly lacked at home. They talked until night fell outside the windows. At one point, Mark leaned closer to look at her notes. Sarah caught the scent of his cologne, and her breath faltered. She quickly pulled back, trying to mask her confusion. "Sorry," he said softly. "I didn't mean to unsettle you." "It's fine," she replied, though her voice betrayed her. That evening, she returned home especially late. Daniel was in his study, hunched over his laptop, barely noticing her arrival. "Did you have dinner at the college?" he asked absent-mindedly. "Yes," Sarah answered shortly. She went up to the bedroom and stared at her reflection in the mirror for a long time. Her cheeks were flushed, and in her eyes was a spark she hadn't seen in years. "What's happening to me?" she wondered. The next day, Mark suggested they grab a coffee after class. Sarah hesitated, but eventually agreed. The cafe near campus was nearly empty. They sat by the window, and once again the conversation flowed, easy and unforced. "You seem so serious," he said suddenly. "But I feel like someone else lives inside you." "Someone else?" "Yes, the Sarah who knows how to laugh, to take risks, to dream." She fell silent. His words had struck the heart of her truth. It had been so long since she felt that someone truly saw her. On her way home, Sarah sensed she had crossed an invisible line. Between them there had been nothing yet but words and glances. But those glances burned brighter than any touch. That night, once again, she stared at the bedroom door left ajar. Now it seemed as if the air of expectation itself was breathing through that narrow gap. Something calling her forward, something she feared yet could not look away from. It had rained all day. The campus looked weary. Students huddled under umbrellas. Raindrops streaked down the classroom windows. Sarah sat at her desk, watching as the water blurred the outlines of the trees outside. When the final bell rang, she decided to stay behind and sort through papers. The hallway was empty. Only the echo of footsteps reminded her that the building was still alive. There was a knock at the door. "May I?" Mark appeared, slightly disheveled, raindrops clinging to his jacket. "Of course," Sarah replied, her heart making a sudden leap. "I wanted to offer you a ride." "It's pouring out there," he said. "Thanks, but I usually take the bus." "In this weather?" Mark smiled. "Come on, don't argue." She hesitated only for a second. Then she agreed. His car smelled of leather and coffee. Sarah looked out the window. yet she felt his gaze on her from the side. Soft jazz played quietly through the speakers. "You know," he said, "you have a remarkable gift for listening, even in silence." Sarah smiled. "And you," she answered, "have a way of speaking as if every word matters." Their eyes met. In that moment, something inside her broke. A silence fell between them, not awkward, but charged, full of expectation. Mark pulled up in front of her house. The rain still drummed on the roof. Sarah gripped the door handle, but didn't open it. Her breath grew heavy. "Sarah," he said softly, "I don't want to do anything that will destroy your life." She turned to him. "Sometimes life is already destroyed. We're just afraid to admit it." He touched her hand. She didn't pull away. On the contrary, her fingers tightened around his. Everything after that happened like a dream. She didn't remember how they ended up in her apartment. Only whispers, touches, the trembling in every movement. Her mind screamed, "Stop, this is betrayal." But her body and heart were living a different truth. Later, lying beside him, Sarah felt both emptiness and an incredible sense of release. She knew there was no turning back. When Mark left, the apartment sank into silence again. But this silence was different now. It wasn't empty. It echoed with what had just taken place. Sarah walked to the bedroom door. That night, for the first time, she closed it completely, and that terrified her. In the morning, everything looked the same as always. Sarah made tea. Daniel read the news on his phone, occasionally replying with short phrases. Outside, the world remained unchanged. But for her, everything was different. She looked at her husband and tried to summon the familiar feeling, the devotion that had bound them all these years. But now Mark stood between them. His touch, his words, his breath. Sarah felt guilt as vividly as she felt desire. "I'll be working late today," Daniel said without lifting his eyes. "Of course," she nodded, and inside her everything turned over. Those words now meant freedom. The following weeks became a series of stolen moments. Coffee with Mark in a small cafe, short walks after lectures, rare evenings when they were alone together. Each meeting was like a gulp of air after long suffocation. Sarah felt alive, wanted, needed, but along with that came a growing shadow. Coming home, she would see her husband's suits hanging neatly on the rack, his papers stacked on the table, and her heart tightened. Sometimes Daniel tried to ask, "You look different. Are you all right?" "Yes, just tired," she would reply, avoiding his eyes. She noticed his confusion more and more often, as if he felt something slipping away, but didn't know what. One evening, when she and Mark sat in his apartment, Sarah cried for the first time. "I feel like I'm betraying not just him, but myself," she whispered, burying her face in her hands. Mark wrapped his arms around her and said softly, "You have the right to be happy." Those words warmed her, but the guilt never left. She began lying more often, about staying late at the college, about meeting students, about new projects. Each lie tore her apart, yet the thought of ending it felt unbearable. At night, Sarah found herself staring at the bedroom door again. Now she opened and closed it differently each time. Sometimes she left it ajar. Sometimes she shut it tight. It seemed the door itself had become the symbol of her divided life. One world with Daniel, the other with Mark. And deep inside she knew it couldn't go on like this forever. Sooner or later, someone would open that door too wide. Daniel had always been a man accustomed to control. His work as a lawyer had taught him to notice details. A glance, a gesture, an intonation. And though he rarely showed emotion, his attention to nuance was flawless. At first, it was little things. Sarah began staying longer at work, coming home later than usual. Sometimes she smiled to herself when checking her phone. Sometimes she forgot to close her bag, and inside were things he hadn't seen before, a stranger's book, movie tickets. "Where were you?" he asked one evening when she returned with tousled hair and a faint flush on her cheeks. "At the college, preparing materials," Sarah answered too quickly. Her voice faltered. Daniel noticed. He said nothing, but something clicked inside him. In the days that followed, he observed, not openly, not directly, but in the way he was used to at work, recording every detail. He noticed her new dresses, the unfamiliar perfume she had never worn before. One night, he woke and saw Sarah sitting by the window with her phone in her hands. The screen's glow lit her face, and it was different, soft, radiant. When she saw his gaze, she quickly set the phone on the nightstand and said, "Couldn't sleep?" Daniel said nothing. He lay back down, but sleep never returned. A heavy feeling grew in his chest, one he tried not to name. On Saturday, he suggested, "Maybe we should have dinner out? It's been a while since we went anywhere." Sarah froze for a second, then forced a smile. Of course. The evening passed tensely. He watched her across the table, listened to her laugh, but felt something in it wasn't for him, as if part of her soul already belonged to someone else. When they returned home, Daniel held her hand, but it was cold, almost lifeless. The following week, he did something he had never done before. He checked her bag. It happened by accident, or so he told himself. Inside, he found a sheet of paper folded in half. It was a letter, hastily written, with uneven lines. "You're the only real thing I have. I'm waiting for our next meeting. Mark." Daniel's hands trembled. He read the lines several times, but the words never changed. Everything he had feared had become real. He folded the letter back and returned it to its place. But inside, there was no room left for doubt. That night, he sat for hours in the darkness of his study. Before his eyes stood Sarah, his wife, the woman he had shared years with, and beside her, the shadow of another man. Pain grew in his chest, mixed with cold fury. He understood the conversation was inevitable. The morning began as usual. Sarah was making tea, and Daniel sat at the table with his newspaper. But this time he barely touched his breakfast. His eyes were calm, too calm, and that was what frightened her the most. "Not going to the office today?" she asked carefully. "No, I have the day off," he replied, folding the paper. His voice was even, but there was steel in it. A chill ran down Sarah's skin. Daniel stood, pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket, and placed it on the table in front of her. "Explain." Sarah froze. It was Mark's letter. Her fingers trembled as she touched the paper. A whirlwind of thoughts spun in her head. How did he find it? How much does he know? "This," she began, but the word stuck in her throat. "This is betrayal, Sarah." He cut her off. His voice remained quiet, but the silence was more terrifying than a scream. She tried to say something, but couldn't. Tears welled in her eyes. "Daniel, I didn't mean to. Didn't mean to?" He jerked his head up. "You lied to me every night. You brought lies into our home." He shoved the chair back and paced the kitchen, his footsteps heavy like hammer blows. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. Sarah covered her face with her hands. "A few weeks." The word sounded like a sentence. He fell silent. A long, agonizing pause stretched between them. Sarah felt their marriage disintegrating into dust with every second. "I thought you were just tired," he finally said. "I tried to believe. But you chose him." Sarah raised her eyes. "I didn't choose, it just happened. I don't even understand how." Daniel gave a bitter laugh. "It's always the same. I don't understand. And I'm supposed to understand, right? Supposed to forgive?" His words cut like knives. That evening she lay alone in the bedroom. The door was ajar again. But this time it wasn't her habit. Daniel had left it that way, as if to show that privacy no longer existed. Sarah stared at the crack in the door and felt her life collapsing. She didn't know what would come next, but she understood there was no return to what once was. The house was silent. Daniel and Sarah had barely spoken for days. A heavy, quiet hum between them, making the walls feel closer than usual. She tried to start conversations, but he answered with short, cold words. On Friday evening, he came home early. He took off his jacket, tossed it onto a chair, and walked into the living room. Sarah was sitting on the couch, her hands clenched on her knees. "We need to talk," he said. His voice was firm, like stone. Sarah nodded without raising her eyes. "You betrayed me," he began. "And the worst part isn't that you had another man. The worst part is that you never even tried to stop." Her voice broke. "I felt empty. You were always somewhere far away. I wanted you to see me, to feel that I was still here. And for that, you went to him?" Daniel cut her off sharply. His eyes burned with pain and rage. "You thought you could fill the void with betrayal?" Sarah covered her face with her hands. "I didn't plan it, it just happened." "Just happened?" He gave a short, bitter laugh. "No, Sarah, you made a choice. Every time you went to him. Every time you lied to me." The silence was deafening. He paced the room, restless. "I gave you everything I could," he said, almost in a whisper. "A home, stability, a future. And you—" His voice trembled, and for the first time Sarah saw not anger in him, but despair. She rose, stepped closer, and cautiously touched his hand. "Daniel, I still love you. I don't want to lose you." He pulled his hand away sharply. Too late. Those two words hit harder than any shout. A week passed. Sarah and Daniel's home had turned into a space of ghosts. They barely spoke. Even simple words, "Good morning," "How are you?" sounded hollow, mechanical. Sarah wandered through the rooms, seeing the traces of their shared life. Photographs on the walls, their wedding glasses in the cupboard, the old blanket they once wrapped themselves in together. All of it now felt like relics of the past. She tried to write to Mark, but erased every message. Meeting him had become impossible, not only because of the fear of being caught, but because her soul was torn apart. He had given her warmth, but now that warmth burned like fire. One evening, Daniel came home later than usual. He was calm, almost too calm. "I filed for divorce," he said evenly, taking off his coat. Sarah felt the ground slip from beneath her feet. "Daniel, please," her voice trembled. "Give me a chance. I'll fix everything." He looked at her long and hard. "You closed the door, Sarah. There's nothing left between us." He went into his study, leaving her alone in the hallway. Sarah walked into the bedroom. Everything was as it always had been. Neatly arranged pillows, the soft glow of the bedside lamp, and that same door. She sat across from it and stared for a long time. She remembered leaving it ajar, as if afraid of being trapped. She remembered closing it for the first time when she let Mark into her life. Now the door was half open again. Cold light from the hallway slipped through the crack. Sarah stood and slowly closed it all the way. The click of the lock sounded like a period at the end of the sentence. She understood. This was the end of her marriage, her old life, her illusions. The half-open door no longer existed. There was only the closed one, heavy and impenetrable, in the silence of the apartment. Sarah allowed herself to sob for the first time. Everything that had been dissolved like a dream, and she was left alone with the closed door and the emptiness behind it.